This is Dennis Rundy. I'm here with my co-host, Phil Goldberg. Our podcast and YouTube channel, Spirit Matters Talk, found at spiritmatterstalk.com. It's also found at all the major podcast outlets. And if you go to youtube.com, just type in 3 words, Spirit Matters Talk. And we have many shows that will pop up there. Please, if you're watching or listening, hit the subscribe button. It's free. And for anybody out there who's helped us by making a contribution to keep us on the air and to keep our archives free and open to the public, thank you very much. And if anybody would like to be amongst those that have done that or do that in the future, go to spiritmatterstalk.com and that information is there. We have had many wonderful guests on recently, and we have a great guest back on the show today. Somebody we enjoyed and got wonderful feedback on last time. Paul Muller-Ortega. He is a longtime student of Kashmir Shaiva tradition. He has his doctorate from the University of California. He is well published. He taught at Michigan State University and is a real, in my opinion, Vedic scholar, who has studied East and West, and much to say. And for those that didn't hear his first interview, it's in our archives. And we'll start today by welcoming him back on the show and thanking you so very much, Paul, for taking the time to come on with us today.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be with you guys. It's wonderful to see you.
Welcome back, Paul. Listeners and viewers, we, as Dennis said, interviewed Paul a couple of years ago, I guess, and we talked about his personal path at that time. So if you want to hear more about his journey, we commend that first interview. And so we'll dispense with those biographical details this time. Paul, one of the reasons I was really eager to get you back on the show is Kashmir Shaivism seems to be emerging in the awareness of spiritual seekers, academics. It's kind of been in the shadows of spirituality for most people, but it seems to be emerging. So my question to you is that true? Is my observation true? And if so, why?
Yeah, I mean, I don't follow sort of the sociological trends of what's kind of emerging in that way, as well as I may have at some other point. So but it is true that certainly over the last many years, there have been an increasing number of publications of different teachers and scholars, and of even just references to this particular tradition that are sort of coming more, to the forefront. And it's certainly also true that this is a tradition, historically speaking, that in a certain sense was also lost in India itself. In other words, that though it is a non-dual path to the absolute, it was superseded, largely speaking, historically speaking, by Advaita Vedanta, which is, as we can distinguish these two and say that Advaita Vedanta primarily teaches what could be classified as a renunciatory path to the absolute consciousness. And the Kashmir Shaiva tradition brought forward something very different. It's an esoteric, non-dual tradition to the realization of the great absoluteness, but it was amenable and accessible, and in fact, formulated for householders in particular. And I think that that's part of the current appeal of people, that this distinction, which is an extraordinarily important distinction, that is still not very clear, as it were, in the wider marketplace of ideas, between a renunciatory path and a householder path, and so on, and that then understanding the historical bases. How did it happen that we have these two very different formulations for spirituality that emerge from India, and that then at a certain moment, for many historical reasons, Kashmir Shaivism, as it were, is submerged and is lost. I mean, part of it is that the coming of Islam actually to the northern part of India, and certainly to Kashmir, removes the kind of support historically that was given by the Maharajas and, other important figures for these great scholar, guru, saints, these magnificent, enlightened beings that lived and taught and wrote voluminously for many, many centuries in Kashmir, and particularly, and also in other areas. The term Kashmir Shaivism, I mean, just to be slightly pedantic, is a little bit of a misnomer because it's also found in other places as well. And it also then historically also spreads to the south of India as well. A tremendous number of writers and scholars, even, for example, in Chidambaram, which I know you visited, and in Kanchipuram, and so on, and other places.
Paul, could you, there was a little glitch. Could you say even, did you say even Shankara, as in Adi Shankaracharya?
No, I said even you find authors of the Kashmir Shaiva tradition in the later period in the south of India as well, not just in the north in Kashmir. And I was mentioning, for example, the very famous temple city of Chidambaram and also of Kanchipuram, where in fact later authors who write in this particular vein are also to be found and elsewhere as well. It's a very, it's very attractive tradition in that regard, in the sense that it doesn't require people to establish a strictly renunciatory lifestyle, and in fact it has a different philosophy and perspective on these two paths, as it were, and then it includes also, it subsumes actually a number of paths. Abhinavagupta himself, who was this massive kind of polymathic genius, is one of the great minds that emerged from medieval India, just an extraordinary author at such an incredible level, and so on, was so renowned and famous during his life, just a luminary of enlightened consciousness. And his writing then took into account, in a certain sense, a variety of different approaches to the path, to the method, to upaya, to the marga, as it were, that he was accounting for, and then articulated specific variations of different kinds of sadhanas that were appropriate for different kinds of individuals who might find themselves practicing at one or another of these levels. It's one of the kind of theoretical genius works, and his most famous work is called the Tantra Loka, the shedding the light on the great revealed scriptures of the Tantras and Agamas. So, for many reasons, I think this is something that is attractive to people who want to walk a path and don't necessarily find themselves ready to live, an entirely or strictly renunciatory lifestyle in that way.
Paul, I'm curious. I meant to ask you this last time. You resigned from your university post in 2009. Something a lot of people don't do. It's very, very difficult to get a university post.
Yes.
And the reason I read was to teach about Shaiva tradition to a wider audience. Two things. One is, did you feel somewhat restricted in your ability to teach what you want to teach in that university setting? And how do you reach a wider audience? What avenues do you go down?
Well, I mean, I think it's those are two wonderful questions. I didn't feel restricted in terms of what I actually taught in the university. I had a wonderful time, both at Michigan State and then subsequently for 12 years at the University of Rochester, many, many hundreds of great students, and created lots of courses. But I think that at a certain moment, it wasn't even kind of an intellectual, decision with pros and cons and so on. It was just something that moved inside me. It said, I want to have a different season of my life in which I am able to teach in a way that is not appropriate or sort of ethically possible within the setting of university, at least as university settings were formulated at that time, and particularly wanting to offer practices of kind of initiatory practices of meditation and other practices from the tradition, which I think that as a university professor, one has a certain degree of hesitation involving students in that way. So that, now in terms of, I spent up until, 2 years ago, I spent the better part of 13 years traveling around in the United States, Canada, in Europe, and so on. And giving discourses, giving talks, giving courses, a tremendous number of retreats, et cetera, and so on. And for me, it hasn't ever been about numbers per se. It's more about a certain kind of person who comes with a hunger for deep practice and also for a system of study that is very, complex and intricate, but also deeply comprehensible and accessible, that, I call the theory of the practice. We have the practice of the practice, and then the theory of the practice from the tradition, which explains many, many things that are very, very fascinating. For example, about mantra, or about initiation itself, or what constitute the levels of meditation, or the levels, even the whole discourse surrounding levels of enlightenment, et cetera, and so on, that are articulated in great detail in the tradition. So that it's been really fascinating to be able to offer, all of that.
Mm-hmm.
Paul, I want to get back to the relationship between Kashmir Shaivism and Vedanta, and also yoga, the yoga tradition. Maybe it's my ignorance, but when I hear people speak often of Kashmir Shaivism, I say, well, that sounds awfully like a lot of the Vedanta teachers I know. It sounds very yogic. And I think maybe they're being too academic and splitting hairs. And along with my own impression is, it seems to me that a lot of the gurus, as opposed to academics, they don't make those distinctions so easily. They seem to draw on whatever works. Like some of the ones we knew back in the 70s.
Exactly.
I never heard some of them speak explicitly about Kashmir Shaivism, but it's clear that they were influenced by it.
Yeah.
And they were also, Vedantists, often Advaitists, and they taught for householders, but they were enunciates, and it all gets, a little fuzzy. So do you agree with that assessment? And how do you explain it?
Well, I mean, I think that, my understanding of even the access to this tradition is that many of those teachers only had very preliminary forms of access to this particular tradition. And, if you dial the clock back to the 1970s and so on, they may have had access, for example, to this short text, the Pratyabhijna Hridayam, by a secondary author of the tradition, The Heart of Recognition. It's a very beautiful text. And or they may have had some preliminary access to the Shiva Sutras and so on, but that the major access to the very complex and much more philosophically dense teachings of, for example, Abhinavagupta, were really, it just wasn't there in a certain kind of way. And so that, and I think that also, it's part of the tradition to, there's a different kind of story here, which is a complex historical one in a certain kind of way, which is that when Kashmir Shaivism, as it were, which, by the way, it's an important thing to talk about briefly, which is that though it's called a Shaiva tradition, it's more precise to call it a Śākta Shaiva tradition, which has its primary sadhana focus on a series or sequence of goddesses that are primarily extraordinarily important in the teachings of the tradition. So that you do have traditions that are purely Shaiva, where are focused on forms of Shiva, for example, Sadashiva, solitary form of Shiva that we often see meditating in the Himalayas, et cetera, with the bull Nandan in the corner, et cetera, and so on. But this tradition was focused on a sequence of, there were different streams, lineage streams of the Śākta Shaiva tradition. And part of what happens historically is that when this tradition really dies out as a living initiatory lineage stream in Kashmir, which we don't exactly know when that happened, but it's probably somewhere in the 12th century and so on, for many reasons. Then the teachings of this tradition are also very widespread and disseminated. Abhinavagupta's kind of fame, his illustriousness, then means that his texts are studied and attempted to be applied. One of the things that happens then is that one of those goddess stream traditions, which is predominantly now mainly located in the south, but was also located in Kashmir at that time, which is centered on the goddess Lalita Tripura Sundari, who is the famous goddess of the Sri Vidya tradition. That particular tradition at a certain moment also gets historically appropriated by the Dashanami Shankaraite Advaita Vedanta institution, in which they begin to practice simultaneously and initiate their renunciate monks practitioners in their matas into what they call a Vaidika and a Tantrika forms of sadhana. And the Tantrika form of sadhana was entirely based on the application of Kashmir Shaiva teachings as those had been modified in what later on is called the Sri Vidya. These originally have the Shiva Vidya, then the Sri Vidya in that way. And that sort of amalgam of those two, in which you had side-by-side practice, is something that then is historically carried forward. It has ironies to it. The primary one being that monks were practicing what was primarily seemingly intended for householders, but that the benefit of it was that the preservation of that tradition in other places it happened as well, of course, but that it preserved a lot of these teachings historically within these matas. And then there was a kind of historical just felt a lack of needing to differentiate between them, as if they were separate in that way. They weren't merged, they weren't fused, but there was a kind of amalgam of both the pure Vedantic formulation, which is, entirely renunciatory in character, and then the Sri Vidya tradition, which is primarily a tradition that even today in India is practiced primarily in household or lineage streams, et cetera, and so on. So
what then, Paul, if I could ask the
yeah.
main difference in terms of practice between what the renunciate would practice and what the householder would practice, is there a significant difference? And if so, what is that? And in your Blue Throat yoga, are you mostly dealing with non-renunciates?
Yes. To answer the last question first, absolutely. Yes, I don't teach renunciates, and I've had people come to me who I kind of intuited, or that I just in discourse with them realized were meant for a renunciatory tradition. And I've said to them, of course, you're welcome to be in satsang and community with us, but in fact, your path is really elsewhere, and so on. And a number of people, I won't name names, who have then gone on to, receive sannyas, et cetera, in India, and so on, who hung out with us for a while, but I don't offer, initiation to renunciates. I think that that's something that renunciates need to do, for themselves in that way. That's the tradition. Only renunciates should initiate renunciates in that way. So, but I think that I'm now not speaking about this amalgam in the Dashanami, mattas, as it were, the famous Shankarite Vedanta mattas, but from a particularly a focus on householder practice versus renunciatory practice. It does, a lot of it, in my opinion, comes down to technicalities of mantra and different kinds of mantras. And this is something that, if you were to ask, where is the topic of mantra most particularly pursued in technical detail in the Indian tradition writ large, it is here in this tradition, which one of the names that it has for itself is the mantra marga, the path of mantra, in that way that differentiates itself from, there is a Shaiva renunciatory tradition as well that precedes it. It's called the Ati marga and so on. And those two, coexist and mutually influence each other. But the teachings around mantra, in particular notions of different kinds of mantras, and also the differentiation of mantras for householders versus mantras for renunciates, is an extraordinarily important technical distinction that is already found in the text of the tradition, and that is then replicated historically in many, many of the sort of technical manuals of the tradition. I think that, the notion of those mantras that lead to an ultimate transcendence and a kind of eradication of life into the absolute, that are renunciatory in character, versus those mantras, the character of which is to elicit from that transcendental source of absoluteness the flow of divine creativity of the Mahashakti herself, which then surges up to transform the individual and the life of the individual in a variety of different ways that are very, almost the opposite in a certain kind of sense from what happens for renunciates. The renunciate wishes to, in a certain sense, wishes to disappear. Let me disappear into the ocean, as it were. Let my drop, as it were, vanish and dissolve into the ocean. And the practice of the householders is very different. It's this idea of the surging up, as it were, once again, and that the technicalities with regard to mantra that say certain mantras have certain effects, certain other mantras have certain other effects, the idea that it, I mean, we still hear these sorts of things. People say, well, all mantras are the same, et cetera, so on. Yes, from some absolute level, this was a statement that Baba Muktananda makes in his Play of Consciousness book when he tells the story of his initiation with Bhagavan Nityananda. But nevertheless, at a more surface level of life, these are different instruments that are meant to have different results. And when one wants to pursue the technical details of that, this is the tradition. The topic is called Matrika Shakti, the potency of language, the potency of the word, the potency of the vibration, the spanda, the vibratory character, and how that is modulated when you take a particular mantra and merge it with individual awareness. What are the different kinds of results? It's kind of like chemistry in a certain sense. You get different results from different kinds of combinations and sort of solutions, et cetera, and so on. So I would say that's part of it. I mean, there's much more, obviously.
Paul, let's ask a basic question. When somebody hears the word Shiva and they go to Wikipedia, or they're in a comparative religion class,
Right.
and they hear, well, Shaivites worship Shiva and Vaishnavites worship Vishnu.
Exactly.
And Shiva is the god of destruction in the trinity of Hinduism.
Right.
What does, in Kashmir Shaivism, what does Shiva mean?
Right.
Good
So
question.
that's a wonderful question. Thank you for that. Beautiful. All these questions are great. I think that is an understanding that is transmitted and perpetuated at what might be called a kind of conventional level of a certain kind of religion in that way, and that we differentiate then between a religious understanding that wishes to compactify the Trimurti, the Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva into this triune deity that then is associated with these different actions: manifestation, maintenance, and dissolution, assigning the value of dissolution to. Now, the Shaiva tradition itself, as exemplified in a more esoteric department, as it were, more esoteric tradition, then says, no, all of those, there are actually 5 sublime actions that this reality is continuously performing, including manifestation, maintenance, dissolution, but also concealment and revelation. They're called the Panchakrityas, the 5 divine actions. And there, though you do have anthropomorphic and also mythological representations of Shiva, the primary statements that Abhinavagupta wishes to make, and many of the teachers of the tradition wish to make, is that that is just a way of representing something which is inconceivable and transcendental in its character. And what is being talked about is this unboundedness of absolute consciousness, and an attempt to peer into that structure of ultimacy, of transcendental reality. And in order to be able to have discourse about it, what are the different ways that from language and through art historical representations, et cetera, and so on. So it's not about sort of what could be called the conventional worship. You see this, in the different temples. When you went to Chidambaram, for example, and so you see Nataraja, exquisite, worship of Nataraja. Shiva Kamasundari is standing by his side. Also, there's a Murti of Bhairava and of Dakshinamurti, et cetera, and so on, in a different part of that temple. So you have these different representations of the deity. But even in Chidambaram, then when the Dikshitar priests want to talk about it, to say, yes, but this is just a representation. It represents, this is the heart of the universe. This is the absolute ultimate sort of source place, et cetera, and so on. And yes, we worship at a conventional level. We offer prayers, we offer offerings in that way. We receive grace and blessings, et cetera, and so on, in that sort of transactional way. But at the higher level is the understanding of this ultimacy of reality, which is, to a certain degree, the ordinary mind is incapable of encompassing what that reality truly is. And it is left in that sense to the great practitioners to say, it is only when there is this repeated and assiduous practice in which the immersion into that condition inside an individual takes place over a long time that we even begin to get some notion of the features or contours or dimensions or what it is that is really being talked about. And of course, then the Kashmir Shaiva tradition uses a tremendous number of exquisitely beautiful terms. One of them is this idea of prakasha, the mahaprakasha, the great light this exquisiteness of this divine luminosity within which everything dissolves ultimately, and in the heart of which actually stands this mysterious potency that is the source place from which everything emanates, and that is the sort of the invisible engine of reality itself. And that access to that means that you as an individual lose your awareness temporarily of your body, of your mind, of your personality, of the time period you're in, and you merge with this exquisiteness, the character of which it's alive. It's not just a concept or idea. It is this hyper intense luminosity in which then what you experience is indescribable bliss, indescribable love, compassion, knowledge, understanding, comprehension, and also a relinquishment of any form of limitation that may persist within your mind, et cetera, and so on. And then there is a return, as it were, of the individual back into their, I use the analogy of the life, the wave and the ocean. The wave subsumes itself into that oceanic totality. And then it re-arises once again in its individuality, but it re-arises transformed, empowered, refined, energized in a certain kind of way, purified in so many different ways. And that's part of it. So Shiva there is, yes, it's understood that you have all these extraordinarily beautiful representations. Some of them are what's called Saumya. They're very sweet. They're very appealing. They're very beautiful. And then you have also the opposite, what are called the Raudra representations, that are the frightening faces, as it were. And this represents, as it were, the two sides, in a certain sense, the two sides of the divine, of reality itself, in that way. So yeah, it's a great point.
Paul, I'm curious, when you have aspects of Kashmir Shaivism that you want to go more deeply into, when you have questions, is there a teacher or teachers that you go to that you do further study with?
I unfortunately don't have any such in my life. I mean, I feel like, I started to read these works of Abhinavagupta in my early years in graduate school, some 40-something years ago. And so, there's an inner relationship in a certain sense with these texts, and kind of living. I mean, I'm in my office right now in Santa Barbara, and across from me are, all the texts in Sanskrit of the tradition. And that's what I do mainly, is, not just read them in a kind of superficial way, but digest them, assimilate them, take them in, live with those teachings in that way. I mean, I had two meditation teachers. I don't necessarily, we need to go down that road right now, but I had two meditation teachers in my life, and I did, long sadhanas with both of them. I also had an academic teacher in graduate school who passed away. And I've also interacted with many, many of the great kind of scholarly figures and also saintly figures in India over my lifetime, but that now, at age 72, in a certain sense that I am, it's, that's kind of, you're on your own, it's like, here we are, it's like, take all of that and really.
So I could ask, and when you go into the text, obviously these are texts that you've lived with in a very intimate way for 40, 50 years.
Yeah.
Do you continually discover and deepen understanding as you go through it?
Absolutely endless. It's endless. It's astonishing, actually. It's overwhelming many times that you open something and you go, how did I not see this? I've seen the same past, it's that, and it's that continuous surging of kind of revelatory insight that assembles itself spontaneously. And it's part of the living character of these particular texts in that way, that they have that capacity to summon and activate and elicit that continuity of seeing as into that endlessness. Yes, very much so.
I have one more question, Phil, if I could ask, and that is along these lines. In your years of teaching, whether it's at the university or elsewhere, were there occasions when there was some student out there that immediately got it? Like you felt like you had a connection with that student from many, many millennium back, and that they heard what you were teaching, and then all of a sudden that was enlivened in them, what they had studied maybe before?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think of course, I'm very careful about talking about different people and so on, but I think that happens, that definitely happens, that, I mean, as a teacher is here to serve individuals and to really sort of selflessly serve in that way. And so then people come with their past experience, their past karma. We don't necessarily know what that is. And we don't, I don't presume to be able to judge, as it were, where a person is, anything like that. But certainly there is many times this spark of recognition, this spark of a kind of energy of a certain sort that makes that individual then, be very much interested in pursuing, an ongoing process of consideration and study. And there are quite a number of individuals like that, that I've interacted with over the last 15 years in particular. And then, yes, in the university setting, yeah, there were students who came along, certainly, who you felt there was a specialness about them. You recognized them as, very super intelligent or having some particular inner, kind of feature of destiny in their life that they're going to feed on this kind of knowledge. And, as teachers, then also, as you guys know, you don't always see the rest of the story. It's sometimes, 20 years later, somebody will contact you and say, that particular course or that particular paper I had to write or that particular set of, anyway, stories like that. But definitely, yeah, it is very much alive, and you feel like there's also a mysteriousness to that. There's that kind of a, yeah, for sure.
Have you been to Kashmir, Paul?
No, this is one of the sadnesses of my life. I haven't.
Me too.
Yeah, it's from a political perspective. I really don't want to, say much about that, but I think it has continued to be dangerous, and it's hard to judge. And then I mean, for many years of my life, I just didn't have the money. I mean, I was just a fairly impoverished, a professor and so on. But then, I mean, I've been to India, many, many, many times, but never to Kashmir. And I dream of going there, actually. I mean, I see photographs of it.
I'll meet you there. Me
Right.
too.
Me too.
It's a deal.
Ever since I read about it, there's 2 chapters in Autobiography of a Yogi back to back. We don't go to Kashmir, we go to Kashmir.
Exactly.
And ever since I read about it there, I said, I want to go to that place.
That's right.
And then I knew people who had been there.
Yes.
And then by the time I started going to India, it was pretty dangerous.
Yeah.
And
it's hard to judge. It's really hard to judge,
Hopefully the time will come.
yeah.
Yes, I would love it very much so, very much so.
I have a friend who was there recently, actually, but
Wonderful.
a question, another elementary question, Paul, but I know we've been using terms that some of our listeners won't be familiar with. We talked about Shiva, talked about Shakti. You mentioned that, this Shakti Shiva, it would be a more appropriate name,
Right.
but that aspect of Shakti in relation to Shiva's, it strikes me as very important and often kind of trivialized. So maybe you can explain.
Well, I think that the tradition itself offers us this concept of what they call the Rudra Yamala, or the Rudra pair, which is this sort of mutual relationship that is dyadic in its character, in which there's difference but non-difference. There is the non-difference of ultimate absoluteness, in which no differentiation is possible, and yet the surging up of this relationship, in a certain sense, that is intrinsic to the very heart of existence itself, in which there is this absoluteness and its fundamental potency. And though, at the surface of life, then we do get, for example, a gender differentiation, Shiva being male and Shakti being female. We know that in the tradition itself, the understanding of Shakti is that it is everywhere. It is inside everybody, no matter how they're configured or what their differentiated sort of form may be. And it is this aliveness of everything that exists on many, many different levels, and that is, it's recognizable. No matter where you turn, you're going to see manifestations or movements or sequences or expressions of this exquisiteness that then occur in a variety of different ways. The Shaiva tradition says that she has a kind of a dual character, in the sense that she is responsible, she is the force of freedom that is responsible for concealment, And then she is simultaneously the force of freedom that is responsible for the liberation and the ultimate removal of that concealment and that playfulness of hide and seek, in a certain sense, of, you know, her energy, that it appears everywhere, but everywhere that she appears, she is concealing something, she is hiding something, she is not revealing, she's not, you know, so on. And then in a certain kind of trajectory or certain kind of relationship with that potency, then she begins to operate sequentially to reveal, to open, to illuminate, to, you know, instruct, guide, and kind of draw the person into increasing stages of realization and of, you know, of ecstatic vision and of attainment, and so on in that way. So Shakti, you know, it's, as I said, the Kashmir Shaiva tradition, and has these different goddesses. For example, you have this, she's called Shri Para, but the word Para means ultimate, but she's many times associated with the word. She is the supreme word of the absolute consciousness. She's a form, a tantric form, really, from an art historical perspective, of Mahasaraswati, the goddess of poetry and inspiration and wisdom, etc., and so on. And she is also associated with this notion of, she is the nectar dispensing goddess. So she is said to sit, you know, in the 1,000-petal lotus above the head and shower the individual practitioner with streams of this amrita, this nectar of existence itself in that way. And she is in a triad. This is where you get this term trika. Many times you'll hear this term trika, the triadic school, because there are 3 goddesses, and she has 2 accompanying goddesses who are ferocious. So she is Saumya, she is sweet, beautiful, exquisite, you know, friendly in that way. And then her 2 accompanying goddesses, Shri Parapara and Shri Apara, are very frightening, and they represent other aspects of life in which there's a kind of different kind of, you know, I call it a kind of ferocity of intent in reality itself, that is not necessarily always so, you know, cuddly and friendly, etc. And so, you know, that's one school, the so-called Trika school. You have a different school that Abhinavagupta also writes about, that is associated with the goddess Kali. Not Kali so much as she is understood, particularly, you know, we've become accustomed to Bengali representations of Kali, et cetera, and so on, with the lolling tongue. You know, Dakshineshwar, the most exquisite murti probably I've ever seen, is the Ramakrishna temple, the Kali there, Bhavatarani, she's called, the one who causes you to cross across transmigration. But Kali in the earlier tradition is a sequence goddess. She is the one who is in charge of all the sequences that exist in all of reality. The word in Sanskrit is krama. So this idea of sequentiality. You know, we hear this word sequence, sometimes we think of gene sequencing or whatever, but in fact, you know, once you begin to examine, everything in life happens in sequences. Of course, time, but everything, actually, everything in existence is controlled by and appears and shows itself in the manifestation of sequences. So Kali, or Mahakali, she's called, she has a number of other names in the tradition, is the goddess of that particular so-called Krama tradition. So you have the Trika, the Krama, these are what are called yogini. They're yoginis, not in the sense of female practitioners, but goddesses of the esoteric Kashmir Shaiva tantric tradition. Then you get another goddess who is known as Kubjika, and she is associated with Kundalini. And then the 4th goddess that I mentioned before, Lalita Tripura Sundari, who's many times just called Shri, the goddess of that particular tradition. These 4 goddesses, in a certain sense, represent aspects or dimensions of the Mahashakti as they are found in what we could call ordinary life itself, but also as they appear and show themselves in the extraordinary sequences of the rising toward enlightenment and illumination in that way. And there are different sadhana practices then that are associated with each of these goddesses, quite intricate and complicated, but which also have sort of, you know, I call them compactified versions of these sadhanas that are more amenable for us as Westerners, and so on, in which then really what these masters were after was, you know, I call it a kind of hyper acceleration of attainment on the path. They were in a rush. They were in a hurry. They were the people who were like, it's got to be this lifetime. And they were teaching, the teaching of Jivan Mukti, of liberation while you're still alive in this body. So anyway, that's a little bit more about, this tradition and the presence of Shakti within it. And you're right, many times when people hear Kashmir Shaivism, they think, oh, it's all just about Shiva, it's a male-oriented tradition in a certain kind of way, or he's the, the destroyer god. By the way, I say, well, yes, he could be understood as the destroyer god, but it's also about radical transformation. How do you take a present circumstance and radically transform it into something, it transmutes into something bigger, better, more powerful, shedding, as it were, its previous form, and then appearing in a different kind of form. That's the sort of more kind of esoteric or sadhana-oriented understanding of Shiva in that way. Particularly, in this tradition, you also have the figure of Bhairava. Bhairava is the naked form of Shiva, who wanders around with a scary skull in his hand. If you've been to Varanasi, the Kapila Mochana Ghat, that's the place where the skull drops out of Lord Bhairava's hand, and then he becomes he's the sheriff actually of Varanasi. There's a temple, the Kalabhairava temple in Varanasi. He's kind of the person who gives you permission to visit all the sacred sites, although hardly anybody goes to that temple anymore. But this idea of Bhairava is very much at the center of the tradition. And for me, I've studied for many, many years also this text called the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra, which in my mind is one of the most important texts that appears in this tradition, because it is, to my knowledge, the only tantra, at least, that we have access to so far. And there's a lot more to be discovered in so many different libraries and manuscript holdings in India. Who knows what's in there, that is focused on meditation. This Vijnana Bhairava Tantra is entirely focused on the practice of meditation. It transcends all of these sort of forms of the goddess in a certain kind of way, and it's just focused on this understanding of what happens when you meditate. What are the different dimensions and aspects of meditation? It's an exquisite, fascinating, I call it a treasure text of the tradition, and we study it as well.
And how does the Shiva's Adi Yogi fit in?
Yes, exactly. So that's exactly right. That's actually the face of Shiva. He's often called Mahadeva. When you hear this term Mahadeva, that's Lord Shiva sitting, in the Himalayas, as I said, in asana posture, oftentimes, with snakes wrapped around him, in meditation and deep samadhi, et cetera, and so on, with his trishul, with, there's a little lizard and a parrot in a tree, there's a crystalline stream that goes by, there's a Shivalinga many times, beautiful forest, et cetera, and so on. So that's Shiva as the Lord of yoga and the Lord of yogis. It's a very, very beautiful form of Shiva, and it's Shiva kind of solitary. He's not really apart from the Shakti ever. There can never be, that separation. But the sort of the form of Shiva in which there is no female representation in that way. Whereas most of these other traditions, you have dyadic couples, pairs, or then you also have representations of solitary goddesses, because then the goddesses rise up to prominence. They're either solitary, or to indicate their superiority, they're seated on Bhairava forms as well. The Bhairava forms are their asana mats, as it were, that they sit on. So anyway, this is a lot of very beautiful.
We will have to do well, Paul, thank you for your time, and we'll have to do a part 3, because we could do a whole series. There's so much that you have to offer our listeners. So let's dig a little deeper. Yeah.
Thank you, Paul. And we'll refer our viewers and listeners to Paul's website, which is bluethroatyoga.com.
We'll have that posted up. Yeah.
It'll be posted on the website. Paul, thank you so much. Great to see you again. Thanks for coming. Thanks for being with us, and we'll see you around.
Fabulous. Take care. Wonderful. Thank you very much. Bye.
Phil, that was back on the show for the second time, Paul Muller-Ortega. A lot, we were just chatting before we came on, and some people come on and they're very academic and have studied the sacred texts and know many stories and writings about spirituality, and other people are practitioners. Paul is really both, but I could imagine in his classes he could go on for semesters with he has a very deep volume of knowledge, an area I think most people aren't so familiar with. And it was good you had him define some terms, and it gets very specific in terms of the distinctions between Shakti and Kali and this and that, elements of it like that.
But
Very
it's
interesting
always
and
very
obviously
practical.
very committed to the practice. Yeah.
And always very practical. I mean,
Yeah.
because of my research, I've gotten to know a lot of academics, and I know a lot of well-informed spiritual teachers
Right.
who are from a certain lineage and all that. And the overlap between them, between the scholars and the practitioners, the separation has gotten less discreet in my experience the last 15, 20 years, as more and more practitioners go to graduate school and become scholars.
Right.
And more scholars say, oh, there's more to this than just studying the text.
Right. And it's more acceptable, more commonplace for people to have spiritual practice. I think in some cases, in not so much now, maybe in the academic world, but there was always a fear somebody would come in and teach comparative religions and proselytize about a particular religion. I know friends that have taught comparative religions, and sometimes that comes up, those things, or maybe in some cases in some schools, why aren't you promoting this over that, and so on and so forth. So
especially when the professor also has a guru or is a practitioner in a certain lineage, in which case the others are suspicious of that person in ways they would never be suspicious of like a Jew who's an observant Jew teaching religious studies, or a devout Christian teaching religious studies. There's something about being linked to what they think of as Hinduism, or having, a guru lineage that makes them more suspect. At least that was the case in the past. It was very clear. And some of them had to sort of keep their practice and their personal orientation very private. And those who didn't, often, they could have gotten reprimanded, or people might have.
But you think now there's more flexibility in regard?
I don't know. It seems to have be looser now.
Right.
But I'm not in that world, but I mingle in it from time to time at a conference or among friends. But that's my impression.
Yeah. And his blue throat yoga, it comes directly from this lineage. We talked about it more in our first interviews.
Yes, and we should refer people to that first interview with Paul.
He gets more into
only audio. But yeah, I'm looking at the website now, Blue Throat Yoga. It's a Kashmir Shaivite kind of orientation for sure. And it says that the 3 pillars of Blue Throat Yoga are Neelakantha meditation. We should have asked exactly what that means, although it's probably in our first interview with Paul. And retreats. And I guess now, because of COVID, the retreats are probably virtual, have been, and study. And I would think you can't ask for a better person to supervise your studies in this field than Paul.
Right. And how in India, amongst Vedic scholars, is that tradition? Because I would imagine among the average person, maybe not so much. Is it something very esoteric and very different from a standard tradition? It's something that any of the ācāryas would support or endorse, or is it sort of
Good
more?
question, and I don't know the answer,
Yeah.
but my impression that it's people, there's more and more awareness of it, more and more regard for it, more and more people studying it and looking into it is at least the one or two people I'm in touch with in India would support that.
Well, you
And
mentioned
my
the beginning
feeling,
on the upswing, right?
yeah, that there's
Talk
more
about it.
awareness of it, more interest in it, more
Mhm.
respect for it, and from academics and from the world of gurus. And my sense of the Shankaracharya tradition, I mean, Shankar has actually spent time in Kashmir, and so maybe there's more overlap between that Shankaracharya Advaita Vedanta and the Ramakrishna Advaita Vedanta. Maybe there's more, of a simpatico relationship than it would appear on the
Right.
surface. I don't know enough.
Very, very interesting. It also gives you some idea of when one wants to study Hinduism or do Vedic study, the tradition is so rich and so deep and so diversified, and it's actually the basis of all Buddhism and Buddhist study. So it's great minds for many centuries, millennium.
But
thinking and commenting and so there's a huge depth.
Because of you and I were around Maharishi Mahesh Yogi back in the day, we knew people who were in Kashmir with him.
Right, right. I was just thinking of that, and they loved it. And when they went on those teacher training courses, they lived in houseboats, and you hear great tales. And I think they went there when the weather got warmer. They started out in Rishikesh,
when it was too hot in Rishikesh.
And we should find maybe Prudence Farrow, somebody that's been on the show before. That I don't know if she was up there. Maybe
I don't think so.
Find some folks that were.
But people were.
The world is the way it is, and the place is less
Well,
accessible.
I know for a fact, and I used to say, oh, I'm going to go there too, and I never did.
Same.
But I remember being a fan of Paul Horn, the flautist, and he had an album called Paul Horn in Kashmir that he made with Indian musicians.
Right.
And he was there because Maharishi was there. And a couple named John and Denise Hughes were on with Maharishi, and they went up there, and Maharishi would always meet with Swami Lakshmanju, who was the great proponent of Kashmir Shaivism, although I didn't know the term back then when I heard about him and when I saw pictures of him and Maharishi, and he would always come and talk to Maharishi's devotees and students who were there. And John and Denise became very close to Lakshmanju and became sort of the official custodians of his lineage. And
you mentioned
work.
Paul Horn, for those that don't, I mean, he was we knew through TM, great flautist, and I had him when I had a radio show. I had him on and his wife, and great stories. Very spiritual guy.
Yeah,
a few years ago.
Yeah, but, I interviewed him for.
He did two albums. One he did in the Great Pyramid, and another one he did.
But the first one was the Taj Mahal.
Taj Mahal, yeah.
It was called Inside, and I interviewed him because I wanted to tell his story in American Veda, and I did in short form.
Yeah.
But he was one of the early TM teachers in the mid-'60s. There were only like 10 or 12 in the country.
I remember a story of Kashmir that he told. He was on a boat in Kashmir at a full moon night, and Maharishi said to him, "Paul, can you play silence on your flute?" And I don't know what he did from there. That's a tough request, but anyway.
But the story of the Taj Mahal is he went to India with a film crew when the Beatles were in Rishikesh going to make a film. They stopped in the Taj Mahal, and they got time there when there were no tourists, and he took out his flute and a recording instrument, and it became this huge best-selling album.
Yeah, it was big back in the day.
And it launched a second career. He was a celebrated jazz musician. Now he was called the father of New Age music, and he would make these recordings in sacred places like the pyramids and the Taj Mahal. And he used to, I don't think he liked being called the father of music, but he wore the title well. And anyway, back to Paul and Kashmir.
Manhattan School of Music. But anyway, getting back to Paul Muller-Ortega, really a brilliant
I can't wait
guy,
to learn more.
I'd love to have him back on and just go, I mean, we can go way into this and
you know, Muktananda talked, he was of all the gurus the most immersed in Kashmir Shaivism and spoke about it a lot and discoursed about it.
Okay, Kashmir Shaivism, what is that for those that are not familiar with it? I'm not so familiar with it. What comes out of it? Is it Shakti practice? Is it Kundalini practice? Is it all those
I would think that's the kind of question you should ask. We should ask Paul or other proponents, other students of Kashmir Shaivism. But Muktananda used those kind of methods that you're talking about, or whether it came from some branch of yoga, some branch of Kashmir Shaivism. I don't know enough. But that whole notion of Shakti is definitely a Shaivite kind of concept.
Right.
Anyway, don't ask questions I can't answer, Dennis. It's not.
Well, that's hard to believe. He'll tell me later when we're off the air. So I want to say this. You generally don't speak in terms of current events, but we're recording this in March 2022. What's going on in Ukraine is just horrifying the world and making us deeply sad. And hopefully our show inspires, and I can see people from all over the world listen in or watch now, and that they get inspired spiritually. Because ultimately the answer to these world conflicts that may wind up eradicating Homo sapiens from the planet is going to be a spiritual answer, not any negotiation or military action or whatever. And what has to be done has to be done. But at some point, spirituality has to take hold. And it was interesting in Maharishi book, Science of Being and Art of Living, he mentioned that at different times, spirituality or economics or different areas of life would dominate philosophy. But we need to return to spirituality. So many people we've interviewed are very inspiring. I'd say everybody as inspires some, if not all, and to go to our archives and share them with others. And also, whether you're listening or watching, please hit the subscribe button. It doesn't cost anything to do that. And if you're inspired to contribute, go to spiritmatterstalk.com and help keep us on the air and our archives open and available and always free to all. And we're not a nonprofit. It's not a donation, it's a contribution, but that would be greatly appreciated. And thank you to those out there that have contributed. So many more great shows coming up. Phil,
and we should say this is March 15th. This show we're speaking on March 15th. It won't be on the web for a few weeks, and we hope that by the time you're listening to this or seeing us, the war will be over.
Right, please. Yes.
So let's hope. And if it's not, do anything you can to support the poor people who are suffering there.
Right.
Okay. See you
next time.